search them out. And so I pray that it'll be a blessing to you. So I titled the lesson, Profound Truths for Life and Happiness. And we're beginning with verse 11. So let's begin with this one. Ecclesiastes 7, verses 11 through 18. So this is the long part of the study. And I put the point here as looking at life through wisdom's lens. So let's start. And here's the verse. You have it on your outline there, and I have a couple of the points filled in. And so let me give you the summation of what I believe would be verses 11 and 12. And it is this: the wise understand that riches are temporal, but wisdom endures. The wise understands that riches are temporal, but wisdom endures. Now, here's a question for you. If you could choose between wisdom and riches, what would you choose? All right, we say wisdom, but let's turn it around. Let's flip it around, and you're right. But let's say if the world had to choose, I will make you profoundly rich, or I will give you profound wisdom. What would most of the world choose? They would choose the riches. They would choose the money. Yeah, welcome to Congress. Yeah, go there with a couple $100,000 in your pocket and you leave with $60 million, right? All right, look at Ecclesiastes 7 and verse 11 and 12. Here we go. Wisdom, and you have the outline. You're going to need that to just remind you of word meanings. Wisdom is good. Now remember, this is the wisest man that had ever lived. This is the man that when God came to him and said to Solomon, ask what you will and I will give it to you. And Solomon said, I choose wisdom. And God says, well, I'll give you not only wisdom, but I'll bless you also with all these other things, including wealth. So let's look at verse 11. Wisdom is good with an inheritance. So there you go. Wisdom and riches and an inheritance are good. And by it there is profit to them that see the sun. Other passages he writes to them that are under the sun. So here's the first thought. Two things, wisdom and riches. Both of them are good, right? If you could have both, I will give you wisdom and I will give you money. And you can have them both. You would say, amen, I'll take that, right? The thought in this passage is wisdom is good with an inheritance. And this class, we are perhaps old enough that maybe our parents are close to that time of leaving an inheritance behind. Well, hopefully by this point in life, we've learned enough that whatever we would receive, we won't waste it tomorrow. You give young people an inheritance and they can blow in 2 years what mom and dad have been saving for a lifetime. That's often, I've seen that many times over the years. And so in this passage here then, wisdom is good with an inheritance. Now we're going to talk about wisdom in a little bit, but I want to keep going for right to now. Now again, looking at verse 12. For wisdom is a defense, a protection, a shadow, it's a shelter. And money is a defense. It also is a shelter, a protection. But the excellency, and I put the word meaning there, literally the advantage or the profit. The excellency of knowledge is that wisdom giveth life to them that have it. So, another thought then. Wisdom and money offer shelter and protection. We would agree with that. But knowledge with wisdom endures. Riches can take wings and fly away. Riches are temporal for this life at best. But wisdom, being the wisdom of God, has an enduring presence not only in this life, but in heaven itself, where God himself is the author of wisdom. And so two thoughts then that you have here is that wisdom and riches, they're good. But we know that you can give a fool riches and he will waste it. But you give a wise man wealth or power, he can use it for good. Agree? Part of our problem as a nation is that we continue to promote people into offices where they are money crazed, and yet they lack wisdom. I find it so interesting to watch our government right now. Who would have ever thought we would be in a day where we have billionaires in office who are working for nothing, you know? And again, each of those, every man you know has their faults. But there are some that are there to get rich, and there's others that are there to serve. And sadly, I think we live in a culture in which people are self-serving instead of serving us and the nation, okay? And so the thought then, the excellency of knowledge is wisdom, giveth life to them that have it. I think it was Lyndon Johnson, B. Johnson, he began, what did he call that? The Great Society. And we have literally spent trillions and trillions of dollars to help the poor. And we have more poor today than we have ever had. And we have people who have been entrusted with wealth and riches that were never taught and they were never trained. And so we perpetuate poverty because no one is teaching wisdom and management. Thoughts or opinions before I move on? Yeah, Doc? Short clips? Yeah, yeah. And the guy gave him a job. You know, it was at some. Sure, yeah. I could believe that would happen, right? I could believe it would happen. Someone else. Let's move on. We have a lot to cover. So here's the next verse. Ecclesiastes 7 and verse 13. Now, consider the work of God, for who can make that straight which he hath made crooked? All right? Now, we know that God is sovereign. God is omnipotent. God is omniscient. God is the creator. We know all those things. Those are, for us, biblical truths. Now, with that in mind, verse 13, look at what God has done. And who can make straight which he hath made crooked? Is it possible that God sometimes makes things or even people hurt or crooked or imperfect, and that is his will? There are a lot of times in life that something will happen and the world will look at you and say, well, if there's a God, why did that happen? And we have to accept the fact that there are some things beyond our comprehension. There are some things that we don't have to have an answer for other than the fact that God is God and he does as he pleases. And so if God desires that something be crooked, well, then it's going to be crooked and you're not going to be able to straighten it. Here's the thought that goes with that. The wise accept God's providence, understanding that no man can change what God has determined. Now think about that for a moment. That God is sovereign. And we accept that in his providence, that no man can change what God has determined. Climate changers, saving the world, saving nature, saving the environment. There's a lot of things that you and I should applaud in the sense that we are, as as mankind, we are caretakers of creation. But the fact is that there are some things that God has made crooked, and it's not our place to be able to fix it. Now, we live in it now. I want to make sure that I'm careful on this. We live in a day in which someone can be born with limbs that are imperfect. And the medical technology is such that that imperfection might be addressed and the bone set straight. But that's not really what we're talking about, and we applaud that man can do that. It's the same idea that if someone is hurt and they're bleeding, we know that we shouldn't put the tourniquet on their neck. We should put pressure on where they're bleeding. We understand that. There are some things that are natural. But this thought of straight, let me give you some thoughts that go with it. I'm going to quote a verse, two verses. Listen to them. You can look them up if you want. Ecclesiastes 1, chapter 1, verse 15. That which is crooked cannot be made straight, and that which is wanting cannot be numbered. Another, Ecclesiastes 3 and verse 11. He hath made everything beautiful in his time. Do you know that God even has created the imperfect and the ugly to be beautiful in his way? We live in a culture today that someone can be born with a defect of some sort. Historically, we would not dispose of that kind of individual. But we live in a culture now that can even make the choice in a mother's womb to dispose of what man has deemed is imperfect. And again, I'm speaking of, let's say, a child in a mother's womb, whatever the affliction might be. But is it possible, and we know that it is, that God's will is sometimes accomplished in the crooked, not being straight? Why? Because it's his will. It's his plan. People are born into this life with hurts and flaws and imperfections. But I've seen over the years different families that took in and loved an individual like that. And they didn't have to fix it because it couldn't be fixed. But they came to accept that that individual was not broken. They were simply how God created them. Thoughts? Yeah.
Well, I don't believe that God would purposely try to make something crooked. I don't think he even could. But because of sin nature, I would think that's his permissive will. I don't think he would have someone come into the world with, missing limbs.
But we can say that God is omnipotent, and he did not have to allow that individual to be born with a crooked limb.
Right.
So was it his will or was it not his will?
Well, it's sin nature that we as humans and all creation
Right.
keep going down and down. But thank God for Romans that all things can work out for the good.
Right. But don't, is somebody who has the affliction were to say to you, look at how I was born. If there's a God and look at what happened to me, how can you say that there's a God if that happened to me? Now, we can deal with the sin nature. But is the ultimate answer, well, you're that way because of sin? Or you're that way because God, in his wisdom, allowed it for his will and for his purpose? We have to be careful. I agree with your process, but I think to come to the conclusion that God does not allow that which is crooked to be in this world would be a flaw, because he can be glorified in the imperfection as much as he can in the perfection because he's God. Yeah.
When I look at the verse, I'm not positive on the last E. Is it reflective on
Where are you looking, sweetheart? Crooked?
who, or is it reflective on God? So I'm not positive on that.
Right.
consider the work of God. Everyone can say, like she said, what God does is perfect. He has made everything good and right. So then there's the colon for mankind, for who can make straight that which you have messed up, that which you have made.
I don't think that can be the meaning of the he, though, because the only person in that verse is God. It's not another individual.
I'm referring to the who can make straight.
Who can make that straight, which he, God, hath made crooked.
Well, that's what I'm asking. Is that
Right.
he on God?
It's referring to what God has worked or wrought. Part of it could be, the crooked nature of a river or a stream or whatever. And we've lived in Florida long enough that we've seen where people have said, well, we can fix that. And whether it's the river going into the Everglades or it's a building where there is a cypress head. And so, well, we can fix that. But we always know that there are other complications that follow man's fix, right? And so we in our nature are short-sighted. And we don't really see the value sometimes of that which is crooked. And, I think to look at someone and you say, well, they have flaws. Well, look around the room and we all have flaws. But can God use that which is flawed? And the answer is, of course he can. Let me move on to the next one. Verse 14. All right, in verse 14, in the day of prosperity, how much time do I have? In the day of prosperity, be joyful. But in the day of adversity, consider God also has sat over against the other, that being adversity and prosperity, side by side, to the end that man should find nothing after him. Here's the thought that goes with that. The wise know that God ordains seasons of prosperity and adversity. We probably have all had things happen in our life or in our family life, and we've asked, well, why did that happen to me? Well, there are seasons of prosperity, and there are seasons of adversity. As we grow older, we thank the Lord when we're enjoying good times, but we're probably in this class old enough that we also recognize that there's going to be some bad times too. And they run parallel. They run side by side. One cannot escape the other. If you live through this earthly life, you're going to have prosperity and you're going to have adversity. But here's the thought, and there's so many other things we could give on it. Does this have other notes or no underneath there? No? All right, let me give you a couple of verses, and we won't have time to study them. Psalm 91 and verse 9. Because thou hast made the Lord, which is my refuge, even the Most High thy habitation. Verse 10. There shall no evil befall thee, neither shall any plague come nigh thy dwelling. Now, is that an absolute promise? Or is it, as Carissa said earlier, Romans 8:28, and God works all things together for good. And yet there are some things that are not good, but they're bad. And yet Psalm 91, verse 10 says, there shall no evil befall thee. There is a difference between that which is evil and that which is bad. Evil carries an intent of malice. Evil carries the understanding of that which is not good. So we know that God, being a God who is a God of grace and a God who is kind and God who is merciful, we know that he would never do that which is evil, but he will allow that which is bad. Because all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. And so God doesn't bring things into our life that are evil, but he does allow things that are bad. I've totally lost you, right, Doc?
So would the example where Christ healed the blind man be an example of that, where his disciples want to know, did this man sin
Right, right,
Jesus said, well, no, he was born this way.
right. He was born blind, not because of the sin of his parents, but that God or Christ himself could be glorified. You know what is interesting in all those miracles is that not long after the resurrection and ascension of Christ to heaven, he goes back to, the disciples go to the temple, and on the way into the temple, they pass the blind men and the crippled men. And you think, why didn't the Lord, when he was here on the earth, why didn't he just give a blanket miracle for everybody, right? Remember the one man that was, he was waiting to get into the water when the waters were stirred, and that whole discussion that was there. Well, you know, Christ was obviously glorified in the miracles, but we have to look at life in a way as believers that we look at life in a eternal sense and not just in a temporal sense. In a temporal sense, there are some bad things that happen in life that we really would prefer not to have to go through. But we can be confident that God does not allow that which is evil, meaning that which is out of malice. He's not that kind of God. Let me give you a couple other examples. Job chapter 1 and verse 21, and Job said, naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Job chapter 2 and verse 10, shall we receive good at the hand of God, and shall we not receive evil? In all this did not Job sin with his lips. Now, Job's point of view was going through something, and he was questioning, why am I going through all of this? He would later, near the end of that study, would recognize the sovereignty of God and yield to God's will. Early on, it seemed evil. Later, he reflected on it, and he knew that God was teaching him something that he would have never learned apart from the trials that he had. You had your hand up?
Well, I was before saying that I don't believe God could make evil or bad. With Job, it was God allowed the devil to inflict Job with all
Right,
these things.
right.
But it was a test of
He
faith,
permitted it, right,
right?
right.
It wasn't that God himself was like actually putting bad on Job. It was just his permissive will.
Right. But God allowed Job to suffer, though, that which hurt. I mean, he lost his family, he lost his household, he lost everything that he owned, he lost his health. The only thing he didn't lose was his wife, and she said, curse God and die. Yeah, Will?
The experience of the finite compared to the experience of the infinite, the difference perhaps being
Wisdom, which we're going to get to that in a moment, what the wisdom of God is. Let me move on for the sake of our time here. So here we go again, Ecclesiastes 7, verse 15. Now remember, at this point in our study, chapter 7 marked a turn in Solomon's life. The first 6 chapters really were a negative perspective on life. Chapter 7, you'll notice, has started to read kind of like the Proverbs. It's different now. There's something different that we find in it. And so here's the reflection of Solomon as an old man. Ecclesiastes 7 and verse 15. All things have I seen in the days of my vanity. So the days of one's vanity is what? Emptiness, waste, void. Solomon went from that young man who was telling his son that the fear of the Lord bringeth wisdom, now to an old man that has experienced what it is to depart from the Lord and give himself over to the pleasures of this world. And so now he's writing near the end of his life, and he's saying, now I'm looking back, and I've seen in the days of my emptiness, my woefulness. Then he writes, there is a just man that perisheth in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man that prolongeth his life in his wickedness. Now, I put the thought up here, the perspective of the wise determines their outlook. The world will sometimes ask, why do bad things happen to good people, right? Or why? So Solomon is, in a way, he's kind of thinking like that. And he says that, why does a good man die young? And why does a wicked man die in his old age? Now, we know that's not always the case. There are obviously exceptions to that, but as he's writing, there's a sense that he says from an earthly, temporal standpoint that there's some things in life that are not fair. And maybe every one of us in here maybe are old enough that we've looked when someone dies young, and then when some old wicked soul lived to be old, and you try to rationalize, why, Lord? That's not fair. In fact, looking back over the years, sometimes some of the dearest saints at Hillsdale did not live into their old age for whatever God's purposes were. And yet there were some others that were living on, and you think, Lord, this is not fair, that they could be so mean and live so long. And so as you look at that, let me give you a couple of thoughts that go with that. Solomon, did I put notes up here? I didn't. Okay. I have to be selective of what I do. My point with this here is that Solomon observed two things that did not seem fair or just. That's the ultimate here. It just didn't seem fair that a good man would die young, and it doesn't seem fair that an evil man would live to his old age. And we know that often the evil ones die young, but there was a perspective in Solomon's life that he had seen contrary to that. Let me move on to the next one. Look at verses 16 and 17. I'm going to go ahead and put the summary up here just to maybe help you collectively give some thoughts to this. Ecclesiastes 7 and verse 16 and 17. Be not righteous over much. Neither make thyself overwise. Why shouldest thou destroy thyself? So there are two dangers you'll notice here. The first is to be righteous over much, and the second is to make thyself overwise. Let me turn it around and make a different statement, and I think it does justice here. Righteous over much is to be overly righteous. Or over wise is to be overly wise. Now, somebody would say, well, how can you be too righteous? It could be too righteous in your own perspective of yourself. So I'm going to put up, and I hope I did not. All right, let me suggest that there are false pretenses here. All right? To be righteous over much, to make thyself over wise, is to have a false pretense of who you are. To think you're more righteous than you actually are. To think you're more wise than you actually are. Let me give you a verse that goes with it. It's not on the outline. Romans 12:3. Paul writes, and he says, I, Paul, say, through the grace given unto me, to every man that is among you, not to think of himself what? More highly than he ought to think. The point being is this: it is the natural inclination of our sinful flesh to think we're more important than we really are, or to think we're more righteous than we really are, or to think that we're more wise than we really are. That is a natural inclination of our being. I'm going to go on to the next two verses because it deals with this also. And so in verse 17, again, I'm looking at your outline as well. Be not over much wicked, neither be thou foolish. Why shouldest thou die before thy time? Again, all these thoughts provoking us. So be not overmuch wicked, or don't act wickedly or behave wickedly. Neither be thou foolish, being senseless. Why shouldest thou die before thy time? In other words, you can make decisions in life that are foolish, and you're going to pay the price. Right? You're going to pay the price. How many in our culture go into debt, severe debt, for owning temporal things, and then they live to regret it? I remember back in 2008, do you remember when people were buying and flipping houses? And then there were the ones before 2008 landed, there were some that said, man, this is great, so they bought two houses. And then they thought, that went so well, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go out on the limb and I'm going to buy three houses. And then in 2008, all of a sudden the house market fails and people were losing $100,000 or more on a house that they didn't even own and they couldn't live in. They ended up acting foolish, thinking they were wise, and they ended up suffering the consequences of it. Moving on, I'm going to go on to the next one. Verse 18. It is good, we read, that thou shouldest take hold of this, yea, also from this withdraw not thy hand, for he that feareth God shall come forth of them all. In other words, the man that lives in the fear of the Lord is not going to be prone to fall into the trap of thinking he's overly righteous or thinking he's overly wise, or as we saw in the earlier one, being overmuch wicked or being foolish, because you're going to die before your time. So there are choices, consequences of our choices. Consequences of our choices. The best choice that you and I can make is to fear God. When we fear God and we walk in the fear of God, it really sets a lot of things right. We're not nearly as foolish. We're more conscious of the decisions that we're making, and we're wise enough to weigh the consequences beside the choices. Somebody comment, Sheila?
Well, I'm just going to say,
I forgot my water today. Rob or Tom, would you guys mind going to get me a bottle of water? I would appreciate it. I'm sorry.
Solomon is the one writing this. We here in America think of our politicians, and we look back on ones that we like or ones we don't, and we make references to them in our lifetime. And maybe Saul was in his mind referencing some from the recent past who had thought they were wiser or up above, and God had said to Saul, "Don't spare the Amalekites, wipe them out." And what did Saul do? He spared Agag, he spared the
All right.
possessions, and he lost his life.
Right.
And so maybe in Solomon's mind, he's also thinking of things that are relevant in his lifetime for those kinds of.
He had seen some that thought they were overly righteous, overly wise, and did not fear the ways of the wicked. Yeah.
I think it means a lot the way that that's phrased, where it says to make not thyself wise, overly wise.
All right.
Versus don't be overly wise, because one is it's not saying don't be wise, but don't lift yourself up. So it's interesting the way he phrases that.
All right. So really a good question for us before we move on would be, how many of us, don't raise your hand, but how many of us are hungry to be wise? We're seeking wisdom. We're studying. We're not content with where we are. I would thank you, Tom. Is it possible that in a church, say, such as Hillsdale, is it possible that there are a lot of people that might be very content with where they are and what they know? And so they lose a desire to keep growing and to keep learning. Well, they become overly wise. They're not as wise as they think they are. Let me take you on to the next one. And I know a lot of these you probably feel like I'm leaving it open-ended, and I'm not intended on. Let me try to get back to my point here. I don't know how I did that, but I did it. Verse 19, I'll just put them all up there because of time. Verse 19, wisdom strengtheneth the wise more than 10 mighty men which are in the city. In the city is carrying the idea of in a walled city. So let's talk about wisdom. And I think I have a lot of verses on there. Unfortunately, I won't have time to go through them. But let me talk about the source of wisdom. And I think it was Will that had kind of mentioned wisdom a little bit ago. All right, so wisdom strengthens. It gives confidence. It emboldens the wise. More than 10 mighty men which are in the city. Now, here's the thought. The 10 mighty men that are in the city, what are they putting their trust in? the walls of the city, right? Their faith and their trust is not in God, it's in what they've built. It's in the walls of the city. Now, what is the source of wisdom? And I'm going to read some verses to you. The fear of the Lord is, Proverbs 1 and verse 7, the beginning of knowledge. In Proverbs chapter 9 and verse 10, it's the beginning of wisdom, the fear of the Lord. In Proverbs 15 and verse 33, the fear of the Lord is the instruction of wisdom. And so when we read, wisdom strengtheneth, we need to look at the source of wisdom. And the source of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. And so the ones who fear the Lord and have godly wisdom are strengtheneth the wise more than the 10 mighty men which are in the city. The men of the city are putting their faith and trust in what they have built. But the wise man fears God, and he puts his faith and trust in the Lord. So two things that wisdom does, just for your outline in passing. And I would invite you, we don't have time, Psalm 112 would be wonderful to go home and read. But what does wisdom, godly wisdom, give us that the 10 men who are in the city don't have? The first is this: the wisdom of the Lord empowers. It gives might. Not might in ourselves, but our faith in the Lord. Psalm 112 and verse 2, the righteous man's seed, shall be mighty upon the earth. Psalm 112 and verse 6, surely he shall not be moved forever. The righteous shall be in everlasting remembrance. So it empowers. And the second thing, it emboldens. So the wise man who fears the Lord takes his courage from the Lord. The mighty men that are in the city are putting their faith in the walls of the city and what they have built. So which is the strongest? It has to be the man that fears the Lord. The cities crumble and fail, and ultimately nature itself takes over what man has built. Go ahead.
There's a great example of the Bible that faith is stronger than any city. I mean, with Jericho.
Absolutely.
It's possible that the Israelites could bring down this nation.
Yep.
But just with a shout of faith, literally,
Shout.
it came down.
And the Lord with them marched around the walls of Jericho 7 times. Whoom! That was it. Because the Lord was with them. Their faith was in the Lord. Yeah.
Yielding and flexibility to God's wisdom is better than the rigidness of protection.
True. Because the faith is in the Lord. Let me give you another thought, and I'm going to add this because I want to get to one that's going to stir the pot a little bit if I can have a few moments. Universal sinfulness of humanity. Ecclesiastes 7 verse 20. There is not a just man upon earth that doeth good and sinneth not. We sometimes make the mistake of saying that someone is a good man. If they are a good man, it's only because of God's favor. But in this thought here, that we are all universally sinful by nature. All right, let me move on. Fake news, I thought you would enjoy this. The wise don't believe everything they are told. Now, we've lived in a culture, especially the last 4 and 5 years, where we have been lied to again and again and again by media, by social media, by politicians, just constant lies. I hope and I pray that the righteous have been more discerning, maybe more so than ever, that we understand that we cannot believe everything that we are told. Let me give you some proof verses, 2 of them. Ecclesiastes 7 and verse 21. Also, take no heed unto all words that are spoken, lest thou hear thy servant curse thee. Also take no heed, don't give your heart, place value unto all words, everything that is said, that is spoken, lest thou hear thy servant curse thee. Let me give you 2 thoughts. One, wise leaders do not base their decisions on public opinion. Well, the polls say, And we've learned it's what was the question of the poll. Because man is smart enough to manipulate the question to get the answer that he is looking for. And so over the years, I've had where people would say, I'd be in a staff meeting and someone will say, well, you know, the people are saying you be the people, the church, right? Well, the people I've been told by some, and I sit there and I listen and I finally say, who? Well, some. No. If you're going to bring up something to me, you're going to tell me who. And usually it's one person. Well, one person's not people. But if I wasn't careful, I could be manipulated by one opinion that is passed on to other people that finally makes its way around to me. The fact is this, as a leader, you cannot minister based on public opinion. And that would be true for politicians. The problem we have today is we have politicians in Washington that are legislating according to public opinion. But that public opinion is manipulated, and it cannot be trusted. I remember in 2016, and again, I'm not blowing the trumpet for Trump, but I think he is the first politician that pointed out fake news. That really wasn't in our culture until 2016. And the more time has gone by, the more we've realized it really is fake news. They are lying. Now, a second thought that goes with this, God's opinion, verse 22, and approval should be our desire. So, verse 22, for oftentimes also thine own heart knoweth that thou thyself likewise hast cursed others. Now, so you got to go back, look at the earlier verse. If I listen to what other people are saying and I act upon what they have said, I might end up in a place where my employee is cursing me. There's a policy. It's think before you act. Question. Don't assume what somebody is telling you is the truth, because it may be a lie. And they might not be purposely lying, but they might be deluded themselves. And so I think we live in a culture today of universal delusion. That's why I believe as Bible believers, if we know the Scriptures, we have a discernment that only God can give. If we know the Scriptures. And so what we're looking at today, a lot of these we would look at and say, well, that's a common sense principle, but not in a culture that has rejected truth and rejected God. Yeah, Will?
I would just say, sorry to repeat myself, is the lie market driven? 2G phones, no.
Oh, yeah. Yep. We are driven as a culture and shaped by things that we are being fed. And we live in a day of information that is unparalleled. There has never been a day like today where so much information is flowing at us so quickly. And if we don't have spiritual discernment, we'll fall right into the trap with the rest of the world. I got to move on. I'm sorry, I've got a few more verses. Here we go. Wisdom is unattainable apart from God. So let me give you two verses, and I won't have time to go into them. Here's the first one. The wise do not expect to understand all the ways of God. So if I'm a man or a woman of wisdom, I accept that there are some things that I cannot explain. And I'm not going to be awake at night worrying about it. All this have I proved, says Solomon, by wisdom. And I said, I will be wise, but it was far from me. That which is far off and exceeding deep, who can find it out? So Solomon came to the point that though he was the wisest man in his day, perhaps the wisest that's ever lived apart from Christ, and he came to accept that there are some things that we leave with God. Here's a second thought that goes with that. The wise accept that the ways and purposes of God are often then inexplicable. And I know sometimes we feel the burden that we need to explain things that are inexplicable. There's just no explanation other than the fact I'm going to choose to trust God. All right, moving on. Verse 25. I'll go ahead and give you the answer. Solomon observed the wickedness of folly and foolishness and madness. Notice the active words here in verse 25. He says, I applied mine heart, 1, to know, 2, to search, 3, to seek out, and 4, and to reason. It should be 5 of them, and to know the wickedness of folly, even of foolishness and madness. I don't have time to teach it because there's something else I want to get to, but you can fill in the blanks, all right? Moving on, Solomon accepted, again, the universality of sinful nature, and I want to hit this point, so I'm going to move on. Ready? All right, verse 26. All right, here we go. The wife, the woman, not the wife, the woman. I told you I was going to get in trouble on this one. All right, here we go. Ecclesiastes 7 and verse 26. Here we go. And I find more bitter than death the woman. Now, not just any woman, but this particular woman, all right, whose heart is snares and nets, and her hands as bands. Whoso pleaseth God shall escape from her, but the sinner shall be taken by her. So who is this woman? All right, so let me give you thoughts, and I hope I have them up here. I didn't. All right, let me give you the thoughts. Who is this woman? She is a seductress. She's the one that Solomon writes about a lot in Proverbs. Remember when he was writing to his son, I think Proverbs 7 is one of the passages. He looks out and he sees this wicked woman. That is the seductress woman. And so he describes this woman. By the way, how many wives and concubines does Solomon have?
900 altogether.
Huh?
900 altogether.
Was it 900 or 1,000? 900. So he's an expert on this matter, right? So he writes this then, I find more bitter than death the woman whose heart is snares and nets, which is basically traps and prey. Her hands are as shackles. Whoso pleaseth God. Now, two men. There's two men in this verse. There's the man that pleases God, and he escapes from her. And then there's the sinner that shall be taken by her, and that sinner being a foolish man. I had to fill in the outline, so let me move on. Solomon could not find a righteous woman of wisdom, discernment, and understanding. And so let's look at this verse quickly, verse 27 and verse 28. Here we go. Behold, this have I found, saith the preacher, counting one by one to find out the account. So he's acting like an accountant, a bookkeeper. Now, in verse 28, he writes, which yet my soul seeketh, but I find not. Okay? So he's going like an accountant, he's looking, and he's examining, and here is what he found. One man among 1,000 have I found, but a woman among all those have I not found. Now, can I keep going? Here's the thought. Solomon observed only one man of 1,000, 1,000th, was a righteous man, a man of godly wisdom. But he goes on and he says, but I did not even find one woman that was righteous. Now, that's a little bit provocative, but I'm going to try to explain it. Several passages, and I don't have them up here, and I'm out of time, but let me give you some thoughts to go with this, all right? Genesis 3, verse 6. Who was it that was tempted? Was it Adam or Eve? Eve was tempted. Adam willfully disobeyed God, and he took the forbidden fruit. Eve was seduced. She lacked the understanding that God had given Adam. Genesis chapter 3, verse 13. And the Lord God said unto the woman, What is this that thou hast done? And the woman said, The serpent beguiled me, and I did eat. 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 3. But I fear lest by any means, as the serpent beguiled Eve through his subtlety, so your mind should be corrupted from the simplicity that is in Christ. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 14 and 15. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived was in transgression. Notwithstanding, she shall be saved in childbearing if they continue in faith and charity and holiness with sobriety. The point in this study here is that as Solomon searched the world, he found that wise men, men that are righteous men, were only like 1 in 1,000. But as he did the same search, he found that there was not even one woman. Now I'm going to explain if I get a moment before you leave. In verse 29 then, Lo, this only have I found, that God hath made man upright, but they have sought out many inventions. Let me give you a couple of quotes. This is the Talmud, a quote from Jewish extra-biblical writings. And one saying is, it is better to follow a lion than a woman. Another writes, who follows the counsel of his wife arrives at hell. Proverbs chapter 2 and verse 16, to deliver thee from the strange woman, even from the stranger which flattereth with her words. Proverbs 5 verse 3, the lips of a strange woman drop as a honeycomb, and her mouth is smoother than oil. Proverbs 7 and verse 5, that they may keep thee from the strange woman, from the stranger which flattereth with her words. Proverbs 23 verse 27 and 28, for a whore is a deep ditch, and a strange woman is a narrow pit. She also lieth in wait as for a prey, and increaseth the transgressors among men. I'm going to make a summary statement. The problem with the United States today is that men have abdicated the responsibility of being leaders. And now we find ourselves led by women. Women lead our households. Women lead in our government. The politics that have shaped the United States in the last 50 years are driven by women. But God gave man the responsibility to be the spiritual head and the leader of his household. When men abdicate the responsibility to be spiritually minded leaders, women will always fill the void. When men are no longer the leaders of their households, when they are absentee fathers, the women by nature will arise to lead the household. But this is not what God's plan was. So the nature, as I close, and not giving one woman an opportunity to reply, coward as I am, my point is this. It is the nature of women that they have a natural strength with men to influence, to even seduce. They have a natural strength that is there. And weak men will allow them to be strong. But at the same time, we're not talking about men being abusive, but we are talking about men being spiritually minded and wise. And so every marriage, every church, every nation will always have the dynamic of the male and the female. It is inescapable. And when weak men are weak, strong women will rise. Now, if you want to have a stoning, I can meet you outside and you can pick up a rock.